Hi, everybody. I almost wasn't going to wear all black because I was worried I was going to just be this bobbing head at the front of the campus, but I've said to myself that I'll step out a few times so because I'm so short to the podium. All right. So let me start. I want to start first by thanking the organizers for the invitation to be here today. This is the third time that I've participated in the Indigenous Summer Institute. And I'd like to thank Stephen Foster and Ashok Mather for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to come here and meet with artists, with students, and with scholars and be here in Kelowna. Like Ashok, I would like to start by acknowledging that the place where we are gathering is the unceded territory of the Siletz people of the Okanagan Nation, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to be visiting this beautiful land again. I also want to say that my thoughts are with those affected by the fires whose smoke and haze that we've all been experiencing. For those of us that are coming from out of town, it doesn't seem that ordinary to have 200 blazing fires and sunsets that are this hazy pink. So my title, Expo 67, Rethinking Expo 67, is actually inspired by my participation in the Asian Canadian visual culture workshops that were entitled Rethinking Canada 150 earlier this year. That was organized by my colleague, Alice Jim, an art historian at Concordia University, with her collaborators Ming Tian Po at Carleton and Alexandra Chang at New York University. These workshops assembled different configurations of scholars, artists, and students at each event to trouble, challenge, and to complicate the so-called celebration surrounding Canada 150, the sesquicentennial of Canadian Confederation. So in a similar vein, my intention here is to expand accepted mainstream notions of and approaches to Expo 67, which is frequently engaged in a nostalgic and non-critical manner that celebrates the original event in perhaps the least complex and least interesting ways. Rethinking Expo 67, then, is to try and revisit Expo 67 in critically engaged and hopefully unexpected ways, and think of Expo 67 as a portal into understanding the complex socio-political and cultural moment in the 1960s. So my paper is intended to give you just a small glimpse into the 50th anniversary of Expo 67, ultimately through several artworks that are in the group exhibition in Search of Expo 67, of which I'm a co-curator. So in doing this, I'm hoping to accomplish three things. Firstly, I'd like to contextualize Expo 67 within the contemporary moment of 2017, as well within a larger history of world exhibitions through a small but rich body of scholarship that has analyzed these events as sites of tension and mixed interests and investments. Secondly, I'm going to introduce Expo 67 itself and then give you, I think, what's going to be an extremely brief tour through the exhibition. I'm going to apologize for this in advance. The show only opened about 3 weeks ago, and it's the first time that I'm presenting on this work, and there's 19 artists that are in the show, and I couldn't at this stage kind of sift through or eliminate some of the artists. So I think what I'll be doing instead is kind of clustering them and moving through some of the slides fairly quickly, in the hopes that if you're passing through Montreal before early October, that you'll come and take a look at the exhibition itself. Because finally, I do want to make my focus my final focus and conclusions by closely considering several artworks that are related to two pavilions from Expo 67, the Canada Pavilion and the Indians of Canada Pavilion. Since earlier this year, we've been seeing increasingly contested perspectives on the very notion of Canada 150. Most potently, the suggestion by Indigenous activists and allies in solidarity that the very idea and practice of celebrating the colonial violence and colonization of Indigenous people, which lies at the core of Canada's confederation and construction as a settler nation, is misguided, offensive, and perpetuates the colonial violences that the recent Truth and Reconciliation Commission processes that concluded in 2015, however problematically, were intended to begin to address and redress. At an institutional and discursive level, it is instructive to highlight the functionality of these so-called celebrations and underline the ways, as Sherry Farrell-Rissett has done, to feature how Aboriginality plays a significant role in the production of the Canadian nation. I will return to the specificity of her point, but I'd also add the ways in which culture and artistic production do a certain type of discursive work in nation building, and therefore also in challenging and resisting cultural hegemony and dominance. On Canada Day this year, protests effectively culture jammed the official rhetoric and the visual signifiers designed to celebrate Canada 150, and they continue to do so. Social media semiotics have been at play as hashtags on Twitter and Instagram have included hashtag colonialism 150, hashtag resistance 150, hashtag unsettle 150, and others. As a media studies scholar who focuses on alternative media, these gestures of remixing, remaking, and jamming the significations of these events are of particular interest to me. And as a cultural studies scholar, it emphasizes how meanings are never fixed. Cultures are dynamic and alive. In the context of Montreal, we are hearing far less about Canada 150 and more about Montreal's alleged 375th birthday, celebrating the so-called establishment of Montreal by de Maisonneuve and Jesuit missionaries. And it's within this that the 50th anniversary of Expo 67 is being contained as well. I've been continually surprised over the course of this year when I visited Ottawa, Toronto, and also recently here, of the heavy visual presence of Canada 150 celebrations, especially by corporations such as CIBC, Tim Hortons, Canadian Tire, and I just hope that we're all going to survive the next 6 months of Canada 150. Like the critiques of Canada 150, Montreal's 375th unbirthday unabashedly celebrates settler colonialism, albeit one of a French colonial variety, and the insidious Jesuit religious orientations of conversion. So here's just a screen grab of one of the Montreal 375 official pages. And here you have just some screen grabs from the Eastern Door, which is the website of the community newspaper of the Kahnawake Nation, Kahnawake Mohawk Nation, which is south of Montreal. And here they're reporting on the defacement of Canada 150 banners, which some artists, as you can see on the right, had actually participated in. So the ones that are defaced are actually the official Canada 150 banners. But I also do want to mention too that yesterday, July 11th, was the 27th anniversary of the beginning of the Kanesatake-Oka standoff crisis of 78 days of 1990, when on this day the Sûreté du Québec invaded the peaceful barricades of protesters who were protecting the sacred pines being encroached upon by local developers seeking to expand a golf course. So some people took to social media yesterday, I'm sure as many of you saw, to affirm that this was the birthday that we should be celebrating, not Canada 150 or Montreal 375. So analyzing the discursive functionality of the commemorations is actually not the focus of my presentation, but rather now just to show how contested nationhoods, Indigenous, colonial French, and colonial English are at work during these showtimes, such as 2017. And here I'm using a term that the art historian Ruth Phillips has usefully called them. Showtimes are moments where you have this kind of convergence of commemorations, celebrations, and birthdays, which she says are kind of like rituals in which we actually have resistances that are built into them at the same time. So some of the terms that she points out that are used are on birthday, as I mentioned before, and also decelebrations. So these combined events of 2017, Canada 150, Montreal 375, and Expo 67 plus 50 have triggered tensions and resistances that were themselves present at Expo 67 50 years ago. So what we observe is a battle of origins, of meanings and interpretation, as erasure, revisionism, incorporation, and inclusion constitute some of its key features. 67 occurs within the historical context of world exhibitions, and the first event was in 1851 and named the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations and took place in Hyde Park, London. The title itself gives a very clear sense of how world exhibitions have been nationalistic and capitalistic enterprises from their very inception. They are platforms and sites for examination which are rife with tensions and contradictions that make them challenging to coherently analyze and to comprehend. They elude totalizing approaches. World exhibitions have been and are places and events where new industries and technologies are showcased, where strange and novel experiments are displayed for large publics, and where colonial legacies and fantasies of expansion have been on brazen and prolific display. In spanning this historical period, the association of world expos with colonial histories is integral. As the late post-colonial literary scholar Edward Said has so effectively demonstrated through all of his scholarship, the connections between culture and empire are foundational in the production of imperial discourses, and so too do we see these entangled connections of work in world expositions. For anyone that's interested in world expos, there's this kind of fan site which actually produces some of the most interesting scholarship around world exhibitions, which is the expomuseum.com, and it's kind of a partially crowdsourced site that has the history of exhibitions that are contained here. The representational tropes and displays which have been employed at expositions have been historically included displays of artifacts and technologies, presentation of colonial and imperial narratives, forms of live display and performance that have included humans and non-humans in the guise of ethnographic knowledge production. But it is significant that we can also observe sites of resistance that occur within these allegedly containing and totalizing frames. There's a rich and growing body of scholarship that examines historical representations and participation of Indigenous people and cultures at world expositions, analyzed through the themes of spectacles of race and performances of Indianness. In Paige Raymond's Theatre of Contact, she examines the much discussed BC Kwakwaka'wakw participation at the Chicago World's Exhibition of 1893, a showtime that encompassed the 400th anniversary of Columbus's invasion, invited and organized by anthropologist Franz Boas for the Field Museum in Chicago. A delegation of 15 adults and 2 children set up a West Coast Native village on the exhibition grounds. Significantly, they performed ceremonial dances, the hamatsas or cannibal dance that was actually outlawed in Canada at the same time. Sherry Farrell-Rassette's conference paper entitled Escaping the Cage, Cultural Performance as Activism, 1890 to 1951, which was presented at Concordia's Imagining History Conference in 2012. And I don't think this is actually published, but you can view the lecture online. She speaks to the radical Kwakwaka'wakw performances of 1893, in addition to several other Indigenous performers at other world exhibitions, and other such public performance events. So she's always kind of analyzing simultaneously the kind of variety of representations that are occurring simultaneously. So Farrell-Rassette's description speaks to the specificity of our national frame, wherein she analyzes Canada performing Canada. And although she's referring to earlier showtimes, this formulation is useful to think about the current moment where Canada has been performing Canada 150, but also when micro-resistances have played integral roles in the events themselves. She states, in referring to the 1893 fair, quote, "The competing transnational interests of governments, entrepreneurs, rival anthropologists, and museums jockeyed for space and representative authority at internal world expositions, which resulted in a confusion of objectives and outcomes. But it would seem that this lack of central controlling agency created small opportunities for individuals. The exposition became a space of continuance for Aboriginal arts practices at a time of official suppression, however transient and illusory these spaces were." I originally have 2 media clips, which are actually documentaries from the National Film Board in 1967. But in the interest of time, I'm actually going to just tell you that they're available on the National Film Board website. And the first one is on the Canada Pavilion. And I'm not going to be showing you that one today. If there is a little bit of time, I might show a short clip from it at the end, but I'm going to skip right over into introducing Expo 67. So Expo 67 opened in Montreal on April 28th and ran for 6 months through late October of 1967. Over 50 million people visited the fair, and it was supposedly the heart of the Canadian Centennial celebrations, but it turned out that there were multiple tensions that were surrounding the early planning of the event, which many amongst the organizers and funders wondered why was occurring in Montreal, Quebec, and not in Toronto or Ottawa. In other words, an English city and not a French one. Numerous celebrities and dignitaries visited Expo 67. Just going to show here. And French President Charles de Gaulle's state visit, in which he proclaimed "Vive le Québec libre," the independent slogan of Quebec's separatist movements, to cheering groups of Montrealers from the balcony of City Hall, became a diplomatic incident. It's also into this context of contesting nationhoods that the Indians of Canada Pavilion had managed to create a standalone pavilion, separate for the first time from the Canadian Pavilion. So this year in Montreal, we actually have currently about 9 exhibitions and other events at major cultural institutions that are taking place. And here you have the kind of subsection which covers Expo 67. You can see that at the McCord Museum, which is our ethnological museum, there's a show on fashion and has some costumes of the hostesses from Expo 67. There's an archival photographic exhibition that's happening at City Hall. There's, of course, some of the recognizable architectural icons from Expo 67, Buckminster Fuller's Dome, which was the USA Pavilion, and also Habitat 67 by the architect Moshe Safdie as well. So it's into this context that, that our exhibition is happening at the Musée d'Art Contemporain. So the exhibit brings together artworks by 19 Quebec and Canadian artists that are inspired by the most innovative, experimental, and provocative dimensions of the original events. And it's also featuring original archival, multi-screen, and large format films as well. As one of the co-curators of the exhibition, with the MAC curator and head of exhibitions and education, excuse me, Lesley Johnstone, I'm going to take you on an extremely quick tour of the exhibition. I'm basically going to cluster and just move through quickly. And then I'm hopefully going to demonstrate how revisiting this World's Fair enables a critical reflection of a unique type. And then at the end, I'm going to look at the Canada, about 5 artists that have worked from the Canada Pavilion and the Indians of Canada Pavilion. So a key feature of our exhibition is how it offers new perspectives on Expo 67, which is frequently treated, as I mentioned before, as an historical event through a nostalgic lens. While Expo 67 has a significant place in our collective memory in Montreal's landscape, one thing that made it so exceptional, the creative freedom that was given to artists, architects, filmmakers, and designers to experiment with new forms and technologies, is far less known. And so in providing these contemporary artists, most of whom were born after 1967, with the invitation to dive into the archives and histories of the original event, their new works offer provocative insights into the ways that Expo 67 continues to resonate in the contemporary imagination. So the aim of the exhibition is to highlight this creativity and these cultural accomplishments through various modalities. One is working with the original archives themselves. The second is to kind of rework some of the kind of original ideas that were there, and also to kind of track and investigate the artists' own research creation processes that were taking place. It's also going to be featuring some critical analyses of Expo 67, which will include all 19 artists and the archival materials that they worked with in the show. And it's going to also include 7 new essays that that include work and research by 7 curators and scholars. And this includes 2 essays on the Indians of Canada Pavilion by Duane and David Garneau, who's actually here with us today, and other essays on the visual art, sculpture, and intermediate Expo 67, through archival research and cinema, and also on music and sound arts. All right, so this is where I'm going to race through this to gain a little bit of time here. So I will show you slides which have the kind of names of the artists, and I'll just cluster them a little bit. So this is the opening of the exhibition, in which you have 2 works that are dealing with the history and current state of Expo 67. You have David Ross, which is an extremely large projection. The images here really don't do justice to the works themselves. They're actually quite massive projections. So you have David K. Ross, who actually worked from the original architectural plans and the topological maps of the original mini rail that was at about 40 feet and went throughout the islands and meandered through them. And what he did was he used a drone camera, a drone with a camera on it to simulate parts of the paths. And you have a beautiful 9-minute video where you feel like you're just floating over the current islands. And then on the right you have Cheryl Sim, who I'll speak again about in a moment. This is another amazing shot from David's video entitled As Sovereign as Love. Here's the work of Marie-Claire Blais and Pascal Grandmaison that also deal with the kind of archaeology of the islands themselves. There's some of Mark Rudell's work that had been previously shot in the late 80s and early 90s. You have 5 works here. There's 10 photographs that are in the show. In particular, I wanted to show you this one, which has the original totem pole from 1967 that was carved by Henry and Tony Hunt, and is one of the last traces that exists of some of the original sculptures and pavilions that were at Expo 67. Here are 2 more works, Simon Boudvin and also Stéphane Gillot, which are looking at some of the architecture of the site. And then we had a cluster of works that were looking very particularly at pavilions as points of departure. So here you have the work of Emmanuelle Léonard, who was working from some of the anti-war films that were in the Christian Pavilion. And she starts from 67 and goes to 2017 and has this fascinating overview of a kind of media transitions in terms of representation of war. Jean-Pierre Aubé's installation is based on a kaleidoscope. Here's Geronimo Inutiq's work, which I'm going to come back to in a moment, where he was essentially working from Martinique, which was part of, it's the upside down triangle that you saw on some of the images that are on in the down. Charles Stankovic has worked on the United States Pavilion, Buckminster Fuller's Dome, which he's been working on for many years. And this is a large kind of archival installation that also has multiple moving image components as well. There's also several works that engaged with the sound aspects of Expo 67. Chris Salter is engaging with Yanis Xenakis' 1960s polytopes, which were originally in the Pavilion of France. Kathleen Ritter and David Ritter's audio piece actually sampled many sounds from Expo 67 that had been gathered from radio archives that existed, and they remixed them. They remixed them with other sounds and aspects of DJ culture, hip hop, and they see it as a kind of a precursor to this time. And finally, there was. They actually pressed an original vinyl record, which you can play and you're encouraged to come and touch. And then there was, as I mentioned before, Cheryl Sim's cover version of the theme song, Un Jour, Un Jour, which is a wistful revisitation of the original song. And her work in particular brings the Expo 67 hostess into view, which is often an overlooked figure that I'm going to come back to in a moment also. So there were also several other works. Here is Phil Hoffman and Eva Holtz's work, and also Jacqueline Van Nguyen's films that were based on existing found archival footage. There's Caroline Martel's 36 screen installation that she did in the Place des Arts kind of public area. And finally, there's some of the archival films. This is actually a 48-foot curved screen that is it's a simulation of one of the original films that was originally shown on 11 screens by Graham Ferguson, who went on to invent IMAX in 1970. And there's a photograph here. So I don't have tons of time left, so actually what I'm going to do is I was going to speak to I was going to speak to the Canada Pavilion and also the Indians of Canada, but I think for this context I would like to focus specifically on two artists that have worked from the Indians of Canada Pavilion. So just in terms of the Canada Pavilion, I wanted to mention that there are three artists. There was Geronimo Inutiq, who took from Katimavik as his point of departure. Althea Thauburger, who worked with the People Tree, which is the orange dome here that's on the left, and both undertook a fair amount of intensive archival research in order to produce their works and to redistill and kind of think about these pavilions in the context of 2017. So here's Geronimo Inutiq's work, which has multiple elements and also takes from some of the, or inspired from some of the original sound compositions. This was the People Tree, and this is Althea Thauburger's work, in which she also enlisted for local emerging poets to participate, and she reenacts a performance of Lorraine Monk, who was the original curator of the People Tree, which was allegedly supposed to be portraits of average Canadians. There's another image. This is quite a spectacular piece that she's made. And then there's also the group Leisure, who worked from the Children's Creative Center in the play area that was designed by the landscape architect Cornelia Oberlander, and they've been intensively involved in conversation with Oberlander and research into the archives. And this was the play center that actually happened in 1967. And here's this kind of manifesto letter that comes from the archives, in which she basically talks about her kind of theory of children's creative power. And so this was the installation that they created, in which children were encouraged and invited to play with the logs as they were in the original center. Okay, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn now to two final work. So the Indians of Canada Pavilion has two artists that kind of engage specifically with the archives from this particular pavilion. So the Omiskeko Cree artist Duane Linklater and Krista Stewart of the Upper Nicola Band of the Okanagan Nation both drew on research from Indians of Canada, but in quite different ways, as you'll see. And this pavilion has been cited as being of pivotal importance to the history of contemporary Indigenous art in Canada by numerous artists and scholars. So the significance of revisiting the Indians of Canada Pavilion today, as you'll see from the film clips that I'm going to show you in a moment, is that the pavilion was designed and created by Indigenous artists, curators, and organizers beginning in the early 1960s. It has a very fascinating bureaucratic planning history that I can't elaborate here, but that other scholars have done. But essentially, there was an Indigenous Advisory Committee that was formed by and for the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development in the early 60s, and they successfully lobbied for and attained control for creating this pavilion as a standalone one that was separate from the Canada Pavilion for the first time. So here's an aerial view where you can see the Indians of Canada Pavilion here. This is an image of some of the host and hostesses outside of the Indians of Canada Pavilion. And then here is a screen capture on the side, and a Norval Morris's painting, which you're going to see again in a moment. So the exterior of the pavilion had amazing, dramatic, commissioned original murals by Tom Hill, by Alex Janvier, who you can ask about it later this week when you see him, and also by Norval Morris, as well as several others. And there was the 21-meter totem pole that was created by the Kwakwaka'wakw artist Henry and his son and his son-in-law Tony Hunt. The interior of the pavilion comprised a didactic narrative that was based on a consultative process by the advisory committee with Native leaders, artists, and craftspeople in Vancouver, Edmonton, Montreal, and Amherst, Nova Scotia. And the narrative was essentially composed by responses to the question, what do you want to tell the people of Canada and the world when they come to Expo 67? And as you're going to see, the rhetoric and perspective of the historical narrative that's told here dramatically dramatically challenges settler colonial narrative tropes that positions Indigenous people and culture in the remote past. Here, the temporal references are contemporary and in the present. The text and images explicitly denounce the treatment of Native people in Canada in the first person voice and the present of 1967, including land expropriations, broken treaties, and the residential school system, which was still in operation in 1967. So, switch over here. Actually, I can't remember. This is the clip I wasn't going to show you. So what I'm going to actually do is show you about 6 minutes of footage, but I'm going to skip at 3 different moments so that you can see the exterior and the interior of the pavilion. So as I mentioned, this was one of the films that were made in 1967 by the National Film Board to document some of the pavilions. This is Alex Champi's here. So to return to the exhibition, Duane, Linklater, and Krista, Belle, as I mentioned before, have both drawn their research on the Indians of Canada Pavilion. And Linklater's mural, which is entitled Earth Mother Hair, Indian Hair, and Earth Mother Eyes, Indian Eyes, Animal Eyes, is a series of small paintings that you can see here that is based on a photo of Norval Morrisseau's Earth Mother and her children from 1967. This new mural was actually painted by Julie Ouellette, a Montreal artist, with a notable absence of the artist Duane Linklater himself from the actual painting process. In this work, Linklater is exploring the institutionalization and historicization of Indigenous bodies and artworks. With regards to the original mural, it was in fact Carl Ray, Morrisseau's assistant, who had executed the mural on behalf of the artist for reasons that remain vague, but may relate to the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development's request that Morisseau alter his work, as they found it originally too explicit, depicting as it did human and animal representations nursing on the breasts of Mother Earth. Curator and art historian Carmen Robertson writes about this in her research on several newspaper articles from 1967 in her recent book, Mythologizing Norval Morrisseau, Art and the Colonial Narrative in the Canadian Media. So in its final rendition, Morisseau's mural was altered or censored, and an appropriate distance was kept between Mother Earth and her children. Morisseau's absence is echoed in Linklater's own contracting of Julie Ouellette to execute his interpretation of the hair and eyes of the original design. Linklater's mural reminds us of the colonial legacies that were represented in the original pavilion, and which he states, quote, which we are still experiencing, witnessing, and making our way through today. Moving to the interior of the pavilion, and here's actually an archival image of one of the few interior photographs that we have of the interior from Library and Archives Canada. And this is actually Harry Belafonte, the singer and African-American activist, visiting the pavilion in 1967. So Krista Stewart's vinyl window installation entitled Indian Memento 2017 engages with the complexities of archival material, as she has done with her earlier artworks. Stewart's mother had been the subject of a 1967 CBC documentary entitled Séraphine, Her Own Story, which has been the basis of several iterative video installations by Stewart, including the two-screen installation Séraphine from 2015, in which she juxtaposes excerpts from the original documentary with her mother's video testimony about her residential school experience to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission committee hearings. Stewart had heard that her mother's photo had appeared in the Indians of Canada Pavilion in 1967, and she undertook a search for any trace of her image that supposedly existed. And she looked for this in the documentary on the Indians of Canada Pavilion that you just saw, Indian Memento. So the closing frame that you just saw, this was the last image you saw, it was essentially in this freeze frame that Stewart has actually based her vinyl installation. And this appears at about 12 minutes in the film, and you can see that this image, which is the screen grab, which was sent by Krista, circles the photograph of her mother, the portrait of her mother that she found in the interior of the pavilion. This actually remains one of the few existing moving image documents of the pavilion's interior, and you can see her image at the top. And this portrait depicts a younger Séraphine, a nursing student who later became the first Indigenous public nurse in British Columbia. And this is actually an incredibly breathtaking work that documentation, again, doesn't really do justice to. It's what she's done is she's placed this vinyl, which is based on the screenshot, on 16 windows, and this is actually Krista Belle talking about the work at the opening a few weeks ago, and it gives you a sense of the scale of this installation that she's created on the window. And the ephemeral red-pink shadow that the natural light casts into the space, and that it kind of moves depending on whether there's sunlight or if it's overcast. It really is like entering into a quite exalted space, and there's no filters here. This is the color of the space when you walk through it. So in conclusion, the animation of archives through research creation and artistic practices offer unique lenses for revisitation that activates history and memory and offers significant ways of re-knowing Expo 67, and shifting the nostalgic return to the past into a more present engagement that has changed and remained, with what has changed and remained the same some 50 years later. There's a specificity to these artists' engagement with Expo 67 archives and creative processes from the time as well, which as research creation method enables alternative perspectives on Expo 67 to emerge in ways that other scholarly analytic approaches may not make possible. Working with these artists and with the museum, in some cases for almost 2 years, has been an immense privilege and occasioned a dramatic way of rethinking this 50-year passage of time. I think it's opened up significant pathways for future engagement in multiple directions. The individual pavilions and their formations themselves, which we can find through various archives. Specific topics such as the labor of women at Expo 67, which I think is quite overlooked, and I'm as guilty of that in doing work on Expo 67 for many years, but I think also in examining them and their dynamic roles as hostesses as well. And I actually just want to mention that in one of the podcasts that Ashok was mentioning that's on the Institute website that you can access, there's a conversation about the Indians of Canada Pavilion that I have with the art historian Heather Gugliorti and also David Moses, whose father worked on the Indians of Canada Pavilion, that you can listen to. And it's in that conversation that Heather Gugliorti actually points out the incredibly important and dynamic role that the hostesses played in being interlocutors and essentially engaging with the public as they moved through, as actually the millions of people moved through the Indians of Canada Pavilion. Finally, I think importantly, it offers a way of thinking of research creation as an epistemological approach, by which I mean that it has its own unique mode of knowledge creation that is dramatically different than traditional academic approaches. And I think in this way, embarking on this type of collaboration with artists and writers is one way of expanding the knowledge of Expo 67. So thank you very much.